Okay, hi. Welcome back, everybody. Nice to see some of you. The more faces I see, the happier I am. That's a plea to turn on your screens if you can. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so happy Adar. We are in the month of Adar, which this year is not the month of Purim yet. That will be next Adar. This is a leap year. So we are in Adar 1, Adar Aleph, as it's called. And next month will be Adar Bet with Purim. But that just gives us, double the invitation for joy. Mishanichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. When Adar comes, we should multiply our joys. Halavai, as they say. If only that were the case, we sometimes need a little bit of intention to welcome that joy. So now we get two whole months to work on this muscle of being marbim b'simcha. And it's a muscle that I think probably some of us really need to exercise a little. So today's class is an attempt to do that somewhat through the language or through the lens of Parshat Truma, which is this week's Parsha, which is a Parsha that talks about the building of the Mishkan or the tabernacle. And this kind of inaugurates a set of Parshiot that will really give a whole lot of detail about, architecture and materials and Jewish space, I guess. And that's kind of interesting or boring for some people, really boring for some. But it really is, like the blueprints, the really detailed blueprints for the Mishkan. And so just a word of a background word, I suppose, about the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan is a physical space that presumably, and we'll talk about what this means, was a house of God, an occasion for God, a direction to approach God with. There is a text sheet today. Let's see if we can put it in the chat again. Sorry, I'm just seeing that there's a question about that. In any case, though, right, it's one very elaborate attempt to construct some kind of Jewish space. I indicated this in my writing this week, but I'm going to just, maybe in the course of this, I'll be able to send you the link. There was recently in the New York Times, I think at the end of December, there was a photo essay that was about religious spaces in people's homes. It was specifically, it was in the New York Times, and it was specifically New Yorkers' homes, which, as a New Yorker, I will say, conjured lots of cramped spaces, not the sorts of places that you might otherwise, or that I might otherwise think of as inspired, godly, holy. There was nothing about these spaces that were, wide open, natural sanctuaries, but rather really, really poignant, beautiful portraits of the ways that people make space for God in their homes, on bay windows, in attics, in tiny little closets, at altars, on bedside tables. I just really, really thought this was it's amazing what people do, and amazing to see the ways that we human beings create holiness through material objects and in material physical spaces, regardless of how big, small, beautiful, ornate, or anything they can be. And I was really curious when I opened up it was on the front cover of one section, I can't remember which one right now, and it continued on to another. And I believe that the opening picture was a Hindu space. And I was really curious if there A, would be a Jewish space at all, and B, if there was, what that space would be. So don't want to keep you guessing. There was, in fact, a Jewish space. And interestingly, that space was a Shabbat table. I think there's a lot that we could discuss about, is that Jewish space? Is that not Jewish space? Where do we have carved out spaces in our homes? Ought we to have carved out spaces in our homes? It was specifically home-based. And so it was a picture of a family having a Shabbat meal. But this, I think, is a really interesting and very tangible way of thinking about Jewish space. How do we in our tradition construct space, and how do we invite kind of holiness into those physical spaces? Okay, so with that said, we're going to begin today with Midrash. I oftentimes find the Midrashim that the Sfat Emet quotes to be as interesting, if not more interesting, than his own commentaries on it. The Midrashim themselves are really, really rich. So we're going to start there. Let me open it up for you. And I'm going to make it bigger. Boom. Okay, so I'm going to skip down here though. Well, why don't I begin here? Okay, so the Parsha begins by Daber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Daber el bnei Israel vaikhu li truma. Right, God says to Moses, this is complicated, vaikhu li truma, tell the Israelites to bring or take for me gifts. Vaikhu has a more kind of aggressive, it's not a heavy aggression, but taking is much more active than kind of collecting, or bring for, take for. There seems to be a suggestion that Moshe or God should be taking from the Jewish people, but what are they taking? They're taking a truma, which is a gift, which is something that's voluntarily given. So there's this kind of interesting tension just early on, like, is this about voluntarism or obligation? Who's giving? Who's doing the taking? Like chuli truma me'etz kol ish asher yidvenu libo, right? Take these gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves him. Asher yidvenu libo tikhu et trumati, and let them make me. I'm sorry, you should take for me. Excuse me. Look, I cut that out. Oh no, there it is. Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Okay, so this last line is one that it brings a lot of commentary with it, because there's this interesting distinction between making the sanctuary on the one hand and where God's presence will dwell on the other. So Ve'asuli mikdash seems to suggest let them make me, God, a sanctuary. One would expect that the next line might be so that I will rest within it. But it doesn't say that. Instead, it says, so that I may rest or dwell among them. Right? So make me a sanctuary, not so I will dwell in the sanctuary, but rather I will dwell among the people who build that sanctuary. And here you can already see some kind of ambivalence about that space, right? So it's a space that God is requesting, but God is not, it's not necessarily being housed by. There's some interesting relationship between these two. And so it's in light of that we come to this Midrash. The Midrash offers a series of, metaphors for the kind of transaction that's going on here. 1 second. Okay, so here we have it. V'yesh lecha mikach shami shemecharo nimkar imo. Translation: there are purchases. This is very transactional language. There are purchases, or one could even say acquisitions. There are purchases in which the one who sells them is acquired along with them. So I I don't know what a good example is. I sell you my watch and you get me along with my watch. What does that mean? I don't know. One way perhaps of thinking about it is kind of maybe parts and labor, right? If I sell you I don't know, a part of an appliance, I might also sell you my time. I don't know how to do any of these things, but in theory, my time in putting in, fixing that washer, let's say. But this idea that sometimes a person, right, or maybe a person's time comes along with the object or the thing that they themselves are selling. Here's what's called the nimshal, or the analog. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Yisrael. So God said to Israel, Macharti lachem Torati, kiviyachol nimkarti ima. So it's the Blessed Holy One said to Israel, I sell you my Torah, and as if such a thing could be, I am acquired along with it. And it says, Shene'emar vaikhu li truma, as it is said, and they shall bring me gifts. I want to start with the proof text and work backwards from it. I mentioned that this phrase, vaikhu li truma, is a little bit ambiguous in terms of who's taking, who's bringing. But there's an interesting suggestion here. Vaikhu li truma seems to be read by the Midrash not as bring to me gifts, but actually bring me or take me, capital M, as a gift, right? That God is going to give the Torah to the Jewish people, and in so doing, give God's self to them. This is similar to the idea that we saw both last week and the week before of the acronym for Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Ana Nafshe Katvet Yahavet, which was I, my soul, I write and give to you, right? That the Torah somehow, right, is at its core, or I'm having trouble with these transactional phrases, but is God giving God's self, selling God's self, right? Giving God's self over to the Jewish people. And it's being mediated through Torah in these analogies, right? That God gives a certain thing, but God can't actually separate from that thing, or doesn't want to separate from that thing, or wants the relationship as much as the thing itself. And so God says to the Israelites, take me with you. When you take my Torah, you get me too, package deal. And now here comes an interesting mashal on top of the mashal, or right, analogy on top of the analogy. So it says, mashal lemelech shehaya lo bat yechida. This is similar to a king who had only one daughter, or an only daughter. Ba echad min ha-melachim unitala. And another king came and took her, which doesn't sound very nice, but doesn't in this story necessarily seem to imply coercion, or at least that's not the focus of this story. Bikesh leilech lo la'artzo v'litol li'ishto. And this king asked for her hand in marriage, essentially. He wanted to marry her and take her to his land. Amarlo, the king said, Viti shenatati lecha yechiditi. So the king now says to his son-in-law, right, okay, I'm going to give you my daughter, but she is so precious to me. She is my singular daughter. Lifrosh mimena eini yachol. To really separate from her is really not something I can do. Lomar lecha al titla eini yachol lefi shehi ishtacha. But I also, it's the difficulty of parenting, of letting go but holding on. So you're saying, I'm really having trouble separating from her, but I also can't tell you not to take her, or you're a couple now, you do your own thing. So he says, Ella, tova, zo tova aseli. Rather, just do me this favor. Shekol makom she'ata holech kiton echad aseli. So the king says to his son-in-law, just do me this one favor. Build me just a little in-law suite, right? Wherever you go, like, I just want a little bit of room, right? Wherever you go, kiton echad aseli, just make me like a small room, she'adur etzlechem, so that I can live with you. She'eni yachol lahaniach et biti, because I really can't let my daughter go, basically. Now, I both love and don't love this metaphor. Everyone has different relationships, I'm sure, in their families that might make it a pretty complicated thing to have a father-in-law say to a son-in-law, just, I'm going to come along with you. Like, wherever you go, I'm coming too, right? And a kiton is, I think, actually more like a bed chamber. But there's some overlay here that the kind of Freudian psychologist or whatever, I think would have a heyday with. But be that as it may, we'll read it more charitably, not as an intrusive parent, right, but as a parent who does recognize and respect separation, who says, I can't tell you not to go. I want you to go. Go, like, live your lives. Just make a little space for me too. And so, Kach amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Yisrael. So here's the analogy. So God said, the Holy Blessed One said to Israel, Natati lachem et haTorah, lifrosh hemena eini yachol. I gave you the Torah, like I gave you my child. But I'm having a really hard time separating from it. Lomar lachem al titluha eini yachol. But I'm also not going to tell you not to take it, because actually, after all, I gifted it to you. Ela bechol makom she'atem holchim bayit echad asuli she'adur betocho. But do me this one favor, right? Wherever you go, just make some space for me. Build me one house, it says here. Build me one house, she'adur betocho, that I will live, so that I will live in it, which is to say, live in proximity to you, live in proximity to Torah. Shne'amar ve'asuli mikdash. And that's this midrashic understanding of what God is asking for in building sacred space, right, is a place for God to dwell, so that God can be proximate to those people and those things that God loves, right? Make me a small room, right? And I do love that it's portrayed as a humble request. Make me a small room. Okay, so what does the Sfat Emet do with this? Okay, so here we're back at the Sfat Emet, 1871, and he himself references that Midrash that we just saw. As you saw it all in the form of a paragraph, he says it in a couple of sentences. We'll start here. V'shachanti betocham ki kol taloi be'adam af l'hamshich kedushato yitbarach. This is the meaning of, let me make a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. Everything depends on the human being, even drawing out the holiness of the Blessed One. Af l'hamshich kedushato. Right. So even before he actually gets to the Midrash, what the Sfat Emet notices in the V'shachanti betocham is the emphasis. Betocham means amongst you, or amongst the people, right? And so he notices that the primary actors in this story are people. People make places holy, and not vice versa. God doesn't come visit. Holiness doesn't appear. This is also relating a little bit to our conversation from last week about making God real. People make God real, or people draw out holiness, establish holy spaces and places, right? And he sees that in the verses themselves, right? Ve'asuli mikdash, is God saying, right, you got to do something. You need to construct, right, literally and figuratively, you need to construct spaces if you actually want to experience divinity. You people, we people, need to actually engage in this in a construction process. And he goes on to say, Midrash hamocher nimkar imo. That is a reference to what we just read. He says, as it says in the Midrash, right, the seller comes along with the sold object. V'chen shamati me, my grandfather, Adoni Avi Zikni, Mori Zikni, Zichron Tzedek Libracha L'chai Olam Haba. Okay, that's a lot. He says, my grandfather taught this about the verse in Jeremiah 17:7. Blessed is the one who trusts in the divine, whose trust is the Holy One alone. Or in Hebrew, Baruch hagever asher yivtach b'Hashem, v'haya Hashem mivtacho. Emphasis of this, Baruch hagever, gever is person, right? So blessed is the person who trusts in God, whose trust is I'm going to skip that translation. I'm going to give you my own, right? Baruch hagever sheyivtach b'Hashem. Great is the person who trusts in God. V'haya Hashem mivtacho. Sounds again like an important recognition or statement about the order of events when it comes to, again, the construction of holiness. That first comes human trust, human belief, human, let's say, reception of the divine, and the result is Vaya Hashem Yiftacho. Then essentially God will be your God, or the divine can enter your life only when you actually, make space for it, is essentially the idea here. Ki kefi bitachon ha'adam bo yitbarach ken yesh lo muftach be'emet. Right, to the degree, see how I translate it here, to the degree that one, in accordance with the trust one has in the Creator, so one experiences the sensation of true trust within oneself. Okay, there's a measure for measure being put forward here, which will be made even more explicit in a moment, right? The degree to which one puts trust in, or I'm sort of adding in words here a little bit, openness to, right, the divine, that's the degree to which one can experience it. There's a circularity to it. And he says, V'kach katub midah she'adam moded modedin lo. So this is a statement from the Talmud. It's from Masechet Sanhedrin. It is, here it is. In accordance with the measure that a person meets out for others, the heavenly court meets out for him. Right. So in its context, this is a kind of legal punitive context, suggesting that, right, you get what you give, right? The degree to which you punish others basically is the way that you yourself will be punished. That's what it is in the context of Sanhedrin, of the Talmud. But that is not the way that the Sfat Emet reads this. Moded or modedin are measurement words in Hebrew. And he says, or the way that he reads this is, again, the measures, the lenses, the ways that we circumscribe, right, and make space for God are the ways that we will, in fact, come to experience that holiness or that spirituality. In a way, it's like a kind of, I don't know if this is helpful or more confusing, but it's the way that like philosophers might talk about perceptions, that the measurements of our minds determine what we can actually take in. Right? We think in time and space. Our minds are constructed in that way, and so we experience the world in that way. It may or may not be the kind of objective reality, but it's what we can do. It's what we take in. It's literally the measures of the world that we can handle. And so this is the claim for the Sfat Emet on an individual level as well, not just about humans, but each human being constructs certain kinds of spaces, places, or doesn't, right? Or removes spirituality from certain places, spaces, etc., right? That we're constantly carving out the spaces in our lives for holiness to show up. But that holiness is only going to show up if we do that pre-act, if we choose certain perceptual lenses. That's what he's saying. Ki bevadai Hashem yitbarach malei kol ha'olam kvodo. Okay, so now here he is addressing a related issue, which is what does it even mean to carve out space for a force that is infinite? Milo kol ha'aretz kevodo, right, is a descriptor of God in Tehillim and Psalms, that God is everywhere, right? That God fills all spaces. So how could there be specific, right, circumscribed spaces for that kind of presence to rest? Rak sheyesh hester ki'inyan hagalut she'ashafa holech al yedei madregot shefilim uperush midah hu chiyuto yitbarach betoch hateva shehu b'midah. Ki ba'atzmuto, this is what I think I'll focus on. Ki ba'atzmuto ein sof ukefi ha'emunah shenimdad la'adam hakol me'Hashem yitbarach. Again, so here he's saying that yes, essentially, right, spirit, the ineffable, right, divinity is not something that is limited. Atzmuto ein sof, right? It is essentially infinite, without sof, without borders, let's say. However, כפי האמונה שנמדד לאדם שהכל מהשם יתברך כן מודדים לו בהתגלות לפי אמונתו. Now I'm sounding repetitive, but the text itself is, so forgive me, right? But again, yes, in essence, there is like infinitude, but human beings are finite. And so the Mishkan, or our holy spaces, our perceptive, right, capacities are limited. And in the ways that we actually limit, those are the ways that we might come to experience something like godliness. Okay. This next part is directly addressing, coming back to our opening, which addressed the time that we are in, namely the month of Adar. So Parshat Truma is always linked to Adar. Sometimes Adar Aleph, sometimes leap year, sometimes it's not, but it's always linked to the month of Adar. And so the Sfat Emet is interested in why this talk of construction of spaces seems to align with this particular time of year. And he basically gives a series of associations that attempt to kind of think about that. Of course, in the name of his grandfather, he says, my grandfather says about Chodesh Adar, Alminat, I'm over here, Al-Shem, just did something there, sorry. Undo. Okay. Al-Shem ma shekatzu b'Midrash aseli kiton ve'adur beinechem. So come back to that Midrash that we spoke about. Come back to the father, the king, the in-law who says, I just need a little bit of space to join you. I'll let you go, but I just need to know also that I'll be welcomed. And that I'll have a space to be with you, even in your faraway place. And that language there of that I may dwell with you is the adur beinechem, because in Hebrew, dar is to live. Ladur is to live. Adur is I will live. Right, which shares the same letters as Adar, right? So he says here, even just in this small reference, right? What he's doing is drawing together this more broad claim about the Mishkan, about Jewish architecture and spaces, right? The claim that Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham is God saying, you open the door for me and I'll walk in, or I'll give you my stuff, my Torah, but I'm also going to give you myself in the process. How do we come to know that, or how do we come to receive it, is when we build that extra room. And the month of Adar is then put forward as a chance to do just that, to make spaces for God. Part of what he also says in the paragraph above relates sort of quietly, subtly, to the month of Adar as well. When he talks about, on the one hand, the Ein Sof nature of God, the infinitude, but that in reality, all right, or in the world, God actually does condense God's self or hide God's self within the measures that human beings might actually be able to access. That idea of God shrinking God's self, particularly of God hiding God's self, is also a very strong characteristic of the month of Adar and the holiday of Purim. Purim, that takes place in a story that doesn't name God. Purim, whose primary character's name is Esther, which means I will hide, referencing Anoche Haster Astir, when God says in Devarim that God will hide God's self. That's how there's a kind of wordplay that also the Talmud says, Esther min haTorah minayin. Like, where does the Torah anticipate the character of Esther? And the answer is in Anochi Haster Astir, that there's something essential about Purim and hiddenness, and the importance of being aware of hiddenness itself, or the phrase of modidim lo, the idea that we're living in more constricted ways, or ways that are necessarily smaller than the thing itself, the consciousness, the presence, the infinite one, right? We can't actually be in contact with that. Instead, we live in hastara, we live in places of hiding. But in that very recognition is already the opportunity to, again, make a little bit more space. Kiton echad ve'adur beinechem, right? That if we actually can, on some level, see hiddenness or interrogate those more hidden places, we might actually make a little bit more of an opening for the divine to enter. And he says that's kind of the energy of Adar, is the search or the attempt to create space, create room. He goes on to say, I'll read this part. The Adar al Shem Chizuk, Kemoshe Katuv Adir Bamarom Hashem. Right, he says in the interim here that this kind of process of finding space actually can embolden a person, or can empower, can strengthen. That's actually more accurate. Can strengthen a person, can give a person chizuk, or support. That when we actually create, or again, or construct within our own lives, within our own homes, those spaces for divinity to dwell, we might actually feel some chizuk. The very last association that he makes with Adar is interesting. This last sentence, V'chen amar ki begasut ein ani v'hu yicholim ladur. This is a reference also to Sota, another part of the Talmud down here. In Sota, it says regarding one who is arrogant, the Holy One says, he and I cannot dwell ladur together. Again, playing with that language of adur, ladur. What I think he's doing here, let me come to the Hebrew for a moment, subtly, right? He's essentially stringing verses together. He's not spelling this out. So I could have it totally wrong, but my understanding of what he's doing here is reminding us that we don't only create spaces outside of us, to receive presence, divinity, right? We also need to make space within us, right? And kibigasut ein ani v'hu yocholim lador, right? God says, right, to the arrogant one, like, there's no space for God in you, right? When you take up all of your space, when there's so much ego, there's so much self, there's actually no space for another, right? So God says, I can't live there, right? I can't live inside of a person who is teeming with their own, overwhelming interest in self alone. And so in this way, we have a kind of coming together, I think, of both, right, physical, external space and internal space. On the one hand, using the imagery of the kiton echad ve'adur beinechem, right, of God saying, like, make me space, just make a little space for me, right, in that cramped apartment, in that New York Queens bay window, like just a little, like just a tiny, in the closet, wherever it is, like literally, right, but as importantly, right, if there's going to be any v'shachanti betocham, which is an internal word, if God is going to actually dwell within, we also need to be making space within. Perhaps it's another way of understanding the idea of tzimtzum, or contraction, self-contraction, in a very internal sense, that we have to step back from our own overwhelming self-concern if we are to make space for others, lowercase o, and others, capital O, as well. Okay, so let me make some space for others now, and stop this share. And I missed the entire chat. Sorry. So now I'd like to hear from you. Yeah, okay, Roberta Wall, go ahead.
Thank you. This beautiful Torah. Just this last piece that you were talking about, that Torah is saying we need to make space within us for God to dwell within.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting that just from that first pasuk, or was it somewhere else?
That last part is actually from the last line, not the first, the last line. Yes, from that phrase from the Talmud in Sota, which is Ki begasut ein ani v'hu yocholim lador. I, God, cannot dwell within an arrogant person. Gasut ruach is the term used, which is interesting. Gasut ruach, right? It has the word ruach in there. Ruach, which is usually associated with spirit.
Yeah.
And it's like God saying, if you fill yourself with your own spirit so completely, like, my spirit can't dwell there too.
So katsut,
Gasut.
gasut.
Yeah.
And that means
Arrogance.
Is there another way of looking at that word? That
Gasut ruach. Somebody here who can weigh in if they think otherwise, but I think gasut ruach is a word that's used in a lot of rabbinic literature. Gasut. Yeah. Like,
it reminds me of the Zen koan that many of us have probably heard, where the student is sitting next to the teacher and asking all these questions, or I actually forget what's going on, and the teacher's pouring tea for the student, and the teacher just keeps pouring, and the teacup overflows, and the student says, master, the teacup is overflowing, and the master says, yes, like your mind. There's no room to take in the Dharma. So here there's, and especially in like these teachings about that this is all about receiving Torah. So it said, we've received Torah, and still there's something else to make room for.
Okay, that's a really great point. Yes. So I love that. You just stepped into something that's really important, both with regard to Torah as a book, or Mishkan as a structure, right, there's a clear sense, right, that those things themselves, right, maybe this is so obvious, we don't even need to say it, but it's not obvious in the Torah, right? That those things themselves don't get you God. There's still one step further. And in fact, there's a very beautiful image at the end of the book of Shmot, I think, where the Mishkan, I think it's it. The Mishkan is complete. I'll just say it this way. When the Mishkan is complete, there's kind of like an initiation ceremony that happens. And when you read that, you see this understanding in a very performative external way, right? That the building doesn't get you God, right? And the words don't get you God by extension, right? But there's a way in which, right, God still needs to come along. Or in the words of the Sfat Emet, we have to continue to draw out God, even if we are engaged in these, presumably holy places or holy words. That there is, yes, there's still beyond that something, and that you can, and the idea that comes in tandem with that is that could be very easily misunderstood, right?
Which and Chassidut is saying, don't make a false idol out of books and practices.
Correct.
Yeah, wow.
Correct. Right.
Beautiful. Oh, so beautiful.
Right. Thank you. And I really appreciate the Buddhist image. It's going to stick with me for a while. Thank you. Arnold Black, go ahead.
Well, it feels so ironic, both the Parshat and the Sfat Emet's commentary, that he's talking about, building this room, and as the Parshat describes, it is a very expensively outfitted room. I mean, everything is brought there. Mm-hmm. And back at the ranch, it's not what the people want. They want that golden idol that Roberta just talked about, but this one is that's what seems to give them the comfort that they need. Now, maybe it's just temporary, but it's amazing that this is going on while the other thing is going on.
No, so this is presumably going on after. So if I'm understanding your point correctly, let's just notice together, right, that yes, this is a pretty ornate, little room. Absolutely. And gold isn't the only material that is used, but it is certainly present, and it's present in very important objects like the menorah, and the ark itself will be built out of gold. And it is really noteworthy, right, that this is the same material that was used not too long ago for the golden calf. And one way of thinking about that is about kind of harnessing, right, or literally melding, whatever the right metal word is, but like, right, taking that same material, taking that gold, and now using it in a different kind of a way. So you're right, I think, to say like the people seem to have an appetite for this, and certainly like a Maimonidean read of the whole business of the Mishkan is just that, to take the appetites that they already have, which is for stuff, for tangible stuff, pretty and tangible and sparkly stuff, but to harness it in a different direction. Did you want to just respond to that? Is that, because I might have taken that slightly differently than you did? Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Although I do think the golden calf hasn't shown up yet. That happens in a yeah.
I don't know.
I think so.
Oh, in Kitisa. Maybe you're right. Sorry. I say in Mukdamukhar. That's interesting. Okay. Well, then, this is still the Maimonidean read of the Mishkan as being an attempt to harness in a positive direction. Really, I think you're right, because Kitisa is where it comes up, and we're in Truma. So yeah, that's okay. So yeah. So maybe you're suggesting that God gave him the idea then? Like,
the Torah isn't chronological.
Right. I said that's why so far in Mukdam Mukhar B'Torah, right? We've said that before, that there is no beginning, middle, and end. So the pieces are all potentially fungible, but I'll at least respect the order of the chapters in terms of interrogating this. It is an interesting point. So perhaps I read it out of sequence. So thank you. My bad. Okay, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you for these months of beautiful teaching. I was just thinking of the through point, the thread from Moses trying to talk to the slaves who couldn't possibly hear him because they were so self-absorbed in their own slavery and their own agony. And now there's a journey here. And in this journey, the assumption is that we can hear now. And so Moses can speak to the people, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is why. And they hear it, and they say, we hear it, and we will do it.
That's so great. Before when we were talking about gasut ruach, I think somebody was also maybe hinting at a word which is in the context that you just mentioned, which is kotzer ruach, where they're short. It's some translated as shortness of breath, but that same ruach is there, right? Sorry, let me just be explicit. When the Israelites are still, in Egypt, right? The verses say that they couldn't hear Moses because of their shortness of breath, right? They were so laden, so burdened, so tired. Lots of interpretations of what kutsa ruach could mean, but it is a very interesting insight that you have there, that they can't hear when they're so full of their own misery. It's not arrogance, it's just so full of their own baggage stuff. And the hope is that upon exiting, that yes, their ears will become more open and more space can be made to take in the sound, the voice, the messages of others. That's a really beautiful insight. Thank you. Richard, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to get your help to unpack the last two sentences of the Sfat Emes's middle paragraph teaching, where it says the meaning of, quote, the measure. Is that referring back to the Sanhedrin reference? Okay. And then it says the Holy One's life force within nature is measured when in essence it's infinite. There's that second measure, could that be also hidden?
I think that let me see if this helps, and if not, please ask again. The idea of measurement is on the one hand, specific units of measurement, but here it's used to describe the idea of anything circumscribed and measurable, right? And it's saying that God in essence is Ein Sof, is not measurable, right? Is beyond that. But in nature, in the ways that we experience any kind of God, it is in measurable ways. Not because God is measurable, but that we ourselves operate in a world that is subject to measure. And as a consequence, God is necessarily constricted within that, hidden within that, less than, diminished in a way. And so it is up to us, though, to kind of figure out or decide what means of measurement, right? Or what pathways we might want to engage in. Does that help?
Yeah, that really helps, because the measurement is coming from us. And then the final sentence, in accordance with one's emunah, is one's revelation measured. So that refers to the revelation of God's presence.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not our revealing. So it's our revealing God's presence. Appreciation.
Right. Remember, the first line here is Hakol taloi be'adam af lamshich b'kedushato, right? It is all on the human being to unlock kedusha, holiness, to unlock hitzgalut later on, revelation, right? All of those big words that oftentimes are portrayed as kind of top-down visitations, let's say, right? He sees as bottom-up constructions, literally constructions, Okay, is that good? Okay.
Thank you. Yes,
Shelton, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. Thank you for the teaching today. You talked about making space for Ruah, particularly a lack of arrogance, and someone mentioned being filled with ego. Does rabbinic literature kind of drill down on that point in terms of specific things that that make space for the Ruach as opposed to doesn't? Or is it stated in a more general way?
Yeah, for sure. That's it. So that's a great question. I'll answer it in a very local way and then in a broader way. So in a local way, that whole text about Gasut Ruach does talk about that. And interestingly, maybe for another time, one of the primary and interesting emotions, talk about emotions that do or don't make space. And anger is seen as something that doesn't make a whole lot of space for God. That being said, so that there's like a really beautiful or just interesting commentary over there in the context of our verses. And I think this is a theme that we'll also come back to in a week or two. One of the words that is used over and over again in this week's portion, and again will be picked up on, is nidivut, right? Nidiv lev, or kol asher yidvenu libo. Now, in full disclosure, I have a child I named Nadiv, so I'm very interested in the midah of nidivut, which is generosity. But in this context, right, what is it that makes space, right? Or I'll say it differently. What is the opposite maybe of gasut ruach? Is maybe nidivut lev, is generosity of heart or openness of heart, which doesn't give you any answer in terms of like specific tools, but it does, I think, open up just some different frames for thinking about how we might make space. But we'll drill down on that a little bit more, I think next week or the week after, when we have a chance to play with those terms a little more. Because as I said,
thank you so much. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Allison.
This may be too simple, but I was thinking about a teaching. I was thinking about a teaching I recall that at Sinai, God spoke to everyone in a voice they could understand. And I think that is interesting because it's a generosity about. It's a I think an interesting recognition of the relationship between God and the Israelites, and God's recognition that there has to be a specific, each individual has their own way of hearing.
Exactly. If you were not here 2 weeks ago, you should know there's a phrase, Baruch Shekivant, which means like, congratulations, you anticipated, you understood, maybe without even reading it. So that is exactly the theme that the Sfat Emet himself was and is very interested in as it relates to the revelation at Sinai, right? And it too wasn't just a big voice from above, but when we talked about kolot, the different sounds, the suggestion precisely was sounds that could be heard, that people could attune themselves to in individual and unique kinds of ways. So thanks for weaving those two teachings together. Mitchell, go ahead.
So at the risk of overstating the obvious, this being an IJS program, I couldn't help but think of practices and how practices in a way can be an intangible creation of space. You started alluding to it before, but all sorts of practices, whether it's a midot practice or meditation or prayer, and this notion of taking it upon yourself to start it and not knowing what might arise out of it. I mean, in its, again, most simplistic way, if you don't light Shabbat candles and you don't set time aside, you might have a very pleasant Friday night, but it's going to be a lot different.
Right.
So this teaching really, I find, bears out in my own experiences as they grow sort of incrementally.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else? 2 more minutes or 4 more minutes. Okay. Yes. Ilana, I missed you. Go ahead.
How are you? So no, I was late. I'm putting up my hand. Just debating. The questions that are coming to my mind right now as I'm listening to this beautiful conversation with you and with all the participants is like, and forgive me if I don't mean to be raising any idea of dualism because I don't believe in dualism, but on in this world that we physically live in, is there how why is it's a ketone, but it has to be so small, because at what point is the space too large and too much holiness that we are no longer, let's say, recognize ourselves or can function in our own lives in the way we're supposed to? And I think it's such an interesting idea. And again, I'm not trying to say there's a separation, like God is this much and I'm this much, but that question often is raised for me. How much time in my day can I meditate, and is my goal to subsume my ego? Sure, absolutely, but so then I'm thinking that the quality of the holiness is as important, if not more so, than the quantity. And that's this conversation took me to. That's all. So
that's really interesting. I'll just say, can everyone hear me? I'm hearing some kind of echo or something. Okay. That last point about quantity versus quality, I do think that quantity is actually interesting in the kind of Hasidic realm of mythology, if you will, meaning the grounding story of creation is actually too much quantity of God, by which I mean that the idea of that there was an initial creation that had too much God in it. And there was a shvirat hakelim, the vessels all broke, right? And the result, right? And God had to step back. God also needs to learn tzimtzum, self-contraction, right? There was too much God. And God's like initial, one could say that the primary or grounding act of creation was self-contraction, right? So that there would be room for other. That was the primary move of creation as understood kind of Kabbalistically. So I know you were going for quality over quantity, but I think that measurement of what's too much, what explodes things, right? Literally, metaphorically, right? Is so much right there in this kind of Hasidic tradition, trying to balance that, or to take a different kind of, story, not the creation story, but the revelation story. We have also noticed that, right, the people also experience too muchness of God, right? When they say to Moshe, right, you do it, daber, we don't, this is too much. And so even in this world that is more mediated or is more measured, it does seem like there could also be too much God. So we have to worry about there being too much self. I suppose, God needs to worry about there being too much God, but it is our to figure out how to titrate that to make space within ourselves for the other. But so thanks for raising that. We are almost out of time, but I think we can take Catherine. Go ahead.
So I guess this is just a quick question, which is that our tabernacle, our sanctuary, is a place where people gather. So what is the role of, I know we've been talking about the individual and our relationship with God and so forth, but what is the relationship of the community in this process?
Okay, that's a great question. The short answer is the community surrounds it, right? The Mishkan is not a place, it's small, it's portable. It's not a place that everybody is, into. Later the Beit HaMikdash will have its own issues about who's allowed to go in, where, and whatever, right? But it's not a public space, but it's a public, kind of gathering. It's really the axis mundi. It's like the middle of the entire community. When they would travel, they would have like a particular way of orienting themselves, like this tribe goes to the north and this tribe goes to the south, right? It's quite literally what stands in the center of community. So it becomes the kind of occasion and the anchor of community, if not the sort of site for actual participation itself. Okay, we're out of time. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciated seeing all of you and also hearing so many voices this week. That was really special. So thanks, everybody.